And why is this at the beginning of an encyclical on Freemasonry? Because Freemasonry is liberalism. Liberalism is the exaltation of man over God, the rejection of the supremacy and the primacy of God, and the exaltation of the supremacy and primacy of man. Our new pope is not only called Leo, but he is an Augustinian. I guarantee you, if he really is an Augustinian, I don't think the Augustinians even today are formed without understanding the notion of the city of God versus city of man. Is it about the exaltation of the material creature, or is it about the exaltation and the glory of God? The Freemasonry, the Masonic forces and so forth, they are of the party of Satan, and they will exalt the city of man over the city of God. So Leo XIII was spot on about the errors of modernity, philosophical, political, and so forth. And I hope that our new pope knows Pope Leo beyond just Rarum Novarum and will actually bring to light for this new era many of the ideas of Leo XIII that are more applicable now than they've ever been. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Pope Leo XIV, our current Holy Father, says that he chose his name based on the writings or based on the legacy of Pope Leo XIII, who, among other things, wrote an encyclical about the state of the modern economy in a post-industrial revolution age, and that encyclical is called Rarum Novarum, and our current Holy Father has talked about how that's very important to him. We're going to go over that document today to see what's there. Also, we are going to talk about some of the other things that Pope Leo XIII wrote, which I hope our current Pope Leo is well aware of and will embrace as well, because if he does, that will be a very good thing. Stay tuned. All right, I'm going to pull up the document here in a second and some notes I've put together. But first, I want to remind you I am going to the Holy Land this September on a traditional Catholic pilgrimage through the Holy Land, the footsteps of our Lord, Our Lady, the Apostles, and so forth, with a traditional Catholic priest providing the traditional Mass every single day. Once in a lifetime trip. You're not going to want to miss it if you have time. It's filling up, so please make sure that you consider signing up before registration is closed in a couple months. All right, let's get into it. So this is the document written by Pope Leo XIII called Rarum Novarum. Rarum Novarum, encyclical of Pope Leo XIII on capital and labor. I'll make it a little bit bigger for you. I'm not going to read the whole thing here. It's huge. As an audiobook, it takes somewhere around an hour and 15 minutes. I've seen it recorded, so that's a pretty long one. But I will read just a little bit at the beginning to give you the context. And it's about the rights and duties of capital and labor. Now, I just want to say before we continue, there are many different opinions people have on things like economics, and Catholics can disagree. There's nothing wrong with that. But the spirit of this document, I think, is really important and still monumental for today. Just from a moral perspective, I think no matter what one believes about maybe the best way that an economy should be put together for reasons of ones and zeros, which are obviously very important, when we deal with human beings in the workplace and whatnot, these are things that have a moral dimension beyond calculators, so to speak. And I think that's important to keep in mind, and that is the role of the Pope ultimately, and there's a lot of insight in here. But the beginning of the document says that the spirit of the revolutionary change, which has long been disturbing the nations of the world, should have passed beyond the sphere of politics and made its influence felt in the cognate sphere of practical economics is not surprising. The element of the conflict now raging... The elements, are unmistakable. In the vast expansion of industrial pursuits and the marvelous discoveries of science, in the changed relationship between masters and workmen, in the enormous fortunes of some few individuals and the utter poverty of the masses, the increased self-reliance and closer mutual combination of the working classes, as also, finally, in the prevailing moral degeneracy. The momentous gravity of the state of things now obtaining fills every mind with painful apprehension. Wise men are discussing it. Practical men are proposing schemes. Popular meetings, legislatures, and rulers of nations are all busied with it. Actually, there is no question which has taken deeper hold on the public mind. So the context here being in the late 1800s, late 19th century, the world had changed drastically. Remember, this is after the age of revolutions. For the most part, there were some other ones to come after that, but you think of the American Revolution, you think of the French Revolution, you think of the revolutions in the mid-19th century in Italy and other places in Europe. You think of what was on the menu coming after this age with the world wars and the communist revolution and so forth. This was a time of a lot of upheaval. And a huge amount of this unrest in society was based on economic challenges. And again, I'm not going to talk here about specific economic schemes or ways, because I know that there are some faithful Catholics are everywhere from sort of integralist to ANCAP guys, and I love you all, and you all got great things to say. But just from the perspective of what people were going through. Well, technology had not really changed a whole lot for probably over 1,000 years. I mean, I don't know what the exact number would be, but if you think of the life of someone between the year kind of 500 to the year around 1750, there probably wasn't a huge difference. To be honest, you could probably go back further. I mean, people living in the most civilized settings in the Roman Empire probably had similar ways of life as far as the technology used, the way they built things, the way that farming was done and whatnot. It wasn't hugely different until basically the invention of the combustion engine, which changed things. And because of that, there had developed over a long period of time economic structures that were a part of the common life of citizens in a way that weren't just a matter of dollars and cents, but they were a matter of decorum, relationships, meal times, worship. Everything had this long period of time to sort of coalesce into this cohesive way of life. You know, as traditional Catholics, we often lament the fact that I would love it if the Angelus bells would ring at 6, 12, and 6, and we would all stop and pray and, you know, that sort of thing. To be honest, if we look at Muslim societies, not to give Muslim any kind words as far as the doctrines, when you look at the very strict Muslim societies, they've really taken into account the lifestyle of people, and they've sort of, in some ways, made it so that their political and economic lives are engineered around the religious life, giving time for prayer and whatnot, and what they regard as holy seasons and things. But that was lost in the West. It was destroyed purposefully with revolutions. And the combination of that with industrial change was huge. And although we can look now at a lot of our technological advancements as having been positive, we all like indoor plumbing. We like the fact that there have been scientific advancements in things like surgeries and stuff. You know, I had some pretty bad knee injuries back in the day, and I'd likely be limping now if it wasn't for them being able to nicely fix my meniscus and ACL and MCL with all their tricks and, and things they do, and I'm happy about that. Nonetheless, that time of that 1800s, 18th, 19th century, there's a reason why when you read Dickensian literature about what it was like in England where it was going strong, I mean, there's a reason why there was a lot of pain and suffering. Life had been destroyed. The old way of life was completely turned upside down, and with it came chaos and a lot of moral degeneracy, which was something that really hurt the heart of the Holy Father, and he wanted to talk about it. And as Catholics, we have to believe that our interactions with economics and so forth have a moral element. Where that line is always, there might be some room for debate, but it's there. And this document that he wrote tried to address that. So let's look at some of the key points. Let me just bring up the presentation or the point form notes that I've put together. Okay, so these are 10 points, more or less, from that. So the context of industrialization, this is in paragraph 1, and I already read this to you. And so the spirit of revolutionary change and so forth that I talked about, so I'll kind of move on to the next one. And then in paragraph 20, and I'm not going in any particular order here, they're just sort of points that I wanted to talk about. He talked about the dignity of workers, that every worker has inherent dignity, and labor is not merely a commodity, but a human act deserving respect. In paragraph 20, he writes, the following duties bind the wealthy owner and the employer. not to look upon their work people as their bondsmen, but to respect in every man his dignity as a person ennobled by Christian character. Now, we get nervous in our day for many reasons when we hear human dignity, because this has been used and adopted by the liberals and the modernists to, say things that it ought not say. So, the modernists will say, because of our human dignity, we all have the right to believe what we want to believe and spread that because of our conscience or whatever. Well, that's not what Pope Leo XIII was saying. He was talking about how you can't treat your workers like they're chattel, like they're cattle, because they're not. And that was something that was becoming commonplace. The rights of workers was addressed. Workers have the right to just wages, safe working conditions, and reasonable hours to live a decent life. In paragraph 45, he says, let the working man and the employer make free agreements, and in particular, let them agree freely as to the wages. Nevertheless, there underlies a dictate of natural justice, more imperious and ancient than any bargain between man and man, namely that wages ought not to be insufficient to support a frugal and well-behaved wage earner. This affirms the right to a living wage, ensuring workers can sustain themselves and their families. Now, I will add a little caveat here. We have to understand that Leo XIII is saying that there's an agreement on the wages, and there's also the element that this has to be, in some way, regulated by what's possible. So sometimes people will take this idea and say, and they'll really kind of go the communist route. And remember the context of the time this was coming out, not long after Rarum Novarum, there is this explosion of communism. It was already happening, and this was part of what he was critiquing. But this just shows you what was in the air at the time. People were feeling the weight and the effect of the sort of class struggle, which was being stoked by the revolutionaries. And Pope Leo XIII is trying to come out here and say, okay, the answer is not just a laissez-faire capitalism, no regulations, whatever. And it's also not this sort of hyper-regulated socialism. He's very clear that there has to be this free agreement between the parties involved, and then this needs to consider what the person needs as a wage. That being said, this cannot be used as something that people will sometimes use to justify an arbitrary level of money that each person should get regardless, which becomes something like socialism, which leads to disaster. There are certain jobs that you'll never be able to do to support a family because the thing itself just doesn't generate enough income for the employee to be able to make as much as he would like to in order to buy a house and a car and bring his family on vacation. Certain jobs just won't be able to provide that. And that's always been the case. There have always been various types of employment that were sort of for younger people or something that maybe a wife would do sort of part-time, and certain seasonal stuff and to add to the household income, but they were never meant to be quote-unquote full-time employment. What's also interesting as well is I like how he mentions here, that there has to be, where is it? And wait, why am I missing this? Anyway, I don't know why I'm missing this part here. It's important to look on the fact that he is very clear on the fact that there must be, because of natural justice, the bargain between man and man. And I think that's important. All right, then he goes on to private property, or we're going to go on to that part. As I said, it's not perfectly in order here. And he says private property is a natural right, but its use must consider the common good, balancing individual ownership with social responsibility. And this is from paragraph 7. The right to possess private property is derived from nature, not from man, and the state has the right to control its use in the interests of the public good alone, but by no means to absorb it altogether. So there's a defense of the right of private property as natural, but stresses its social purpose for the common good. Now, this is something that makes us very nervous today. On the one hand, we love the idea of private property, obviously. That's, against socialism, which is not for private property. On the other hand, the idea that the state or the community could have any role in saying what you can and cannot do with your private property is something that makes us very nervous. And I understand that's the case, but we need to understand the concept of Christendom about what property was for. So you've all heard of, for example, the story of Robin Hood. Many versions of it, but the most ancient version tends to be around the conflict between the land owned by the lords not being available for the common man to hunt. And there was a tension there because while we all agree that a person, because of the sort of reality of nature, can find a piece of land and do things on that and sort of mark his territory if he can defend it and so forth, we get that. On the other hand, there is something common about that, at least to a degree, insofar as it has to be worked out amongst members of the community. And for this reason, it was seen as unjust that the average person was not allowed to go hunt, for example, on this common land when there was more than enough resource to be found on this common land that could sustain people needing to hunt to feed their families, while the landlord could still be extremely wealthy. So there was this tension. And over time, Christian states would work out agreements as to how to regulate, for lack of a better term, these things. And one of the modern ways that we've seen this, which most conservative-minded people will probably support, would be something like conservationism, where we recognize that if we go overfish a lake or overhunt a forest, that the population will be decimated and no one will be able to hunt. So we don't mind the fact that there's something common about it and it's stewarded by someone, but everyone has access to it and there are certain rules in place. It's something like that. Also, from a basic Christian perspective, we are supposed to, help the poor and so forth. And from the perspective of moral guidance, the state, which should be listening to the church, has every right, according to Pope Leo XIII, to find a way to implore those with means to help those without means. And then also, sometimes another example would be, for example, during times of war or defense, the state has the right to sort of have people commandeer their resources to help with an effort. And so there's kind of exceptions to this notion of private property. It's not an absolute in the sense that there's no possible way to see any oversight or regulation, but at the same time, it is something that has to be guarded as an axiomatic principle that is sacrosanct. And that's basically the role of private property. And also, we should talk about this word common good here for a second. The word common good is often abused in our modern age. It's not always the same thing as public good, which pertains more to things like access to material resources or having equitable share of material things. But the common good in the truest sense, it's something that's not diminished the more it's shared. So we think of music or art. This is why it's always been something that the high society, the high classes have embraced, is that if they have certain types of art, that they have this moral obligation to the society to share these things and allow people to embrace them. And that was common, even in Protestant England and things like that, in a more sane time. It was common that the lords and ladies of manors and estates and so forth at times of holidays and whatnot would open up their properties to the average person because the beautiful gardens, the beautiful fountains and the orchards and all these kinds of things, the more they were enjoyed, the more glory there was for all, and the things themselves weren't diminished. And that's really what the common good is about. Okay, critique of socialism. Pope Leo XIII does critique socialism. It's rejected, and he says to remedy these wrongs, the socialists working on the poor man's envy of the rich are striving to do away with private property and contend that individual possessions should become the common property of all. But their contentions are so clearly powerless to end the controversy that were they carried into effect, the working man would himself would be among the first to suffer. That's true. And I think that's something that our current Holy Father will probably have to address with the rise of certain technologies and our duties to embrace or not embrace wholeheartedly every single aspect in some way. Because, yes, as we look at the history of socialist societies, it's the poor that suffer the most. Because there's the thing about human nature is we can't get rid of natural inequality fully. We just can't. And when you try to, what you end up doing is taking away the ability of those who are high producers to have anything to share. again, we look at this age of Christendom throughout Europe and the Christian world, and it was not socialist. It was not quote-unquote capitalist, but it certainly wasn't socialist. And there were plenty of classes. There was surely a distinction among classes, but there are certain people that always rise to the top. And if they are implored by strong moral guidance from the church, then they will use those resources to help their fellow man. And when you take away their ability to achieve excellence, then they're not able to help. And then we just sort of have a dictatorship of mediocrity and low standards, which just leads to continual poverty that can't be fixed because there's nothing to go around. Okay, he talks about limits to capitalism. So he criticizes unrestrained capitalism for two things. It's for a couple reasons. Three, basically, is that it helps to facilitate greed, or it plays on people's greed. It leads to exploitation of workers, or it facilitates that. And it exacerbates inequalities that ought not be there. So paragraph 3 says, the mischief has been increased by rapacious usury, which is still practiced by covetous and grasping men. Hence it is that the working classes are exposed to misery and wrong, and the rich grow richer while the poor become poorer. Key word here is usury. Usury does not just mean like, people think it only means high interest. Really, it means interest, generally speaking, historically. There's some debate on whether or not there could be a small amount of interest that is really just kind of a service charge as long as it's checked at a certain amount and can't go above a certain percentage, fine. But the reason why usury is condemned, the spirit of why it's condemned historically in the church, is that it's kind of like a type of wizardry or magic, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So, for a currency to be attached to reality, there has to be a value to it, excuse me, that isn't just ethereal and made up. So historically, there would be a certain amount of confidence in a currency based on the resources the country could back that up with. People will talk about the gold standard and stuff. I'm not here to get into that debate in depth, but that's the historical kind of perspective. And there would be a confidence in the currency based on basically the resources that were and what was to go around in a society, which is why you don't really see things like inflation the way we understand it today for like forever. I mean, for hundreds or thousands of years, because you do see elements of it when they start clipping the money and things like that in the Roman Empire as things are decaying and then the money's worth less and then that sort of phenomenon. But in reality, there's a reason why in the feudal system, peasants could sign a 100-year lease with a landlord and the price would never go up. Because, the value of wheat doesn't really change too much because it's for eating and you need the same amount, if that makes sense. But as industrial advancements and technological advancements came on the scene, the value of someone's labor radically changes. Because it used to be, for example, that, an artisanal craft like being a cobbler was something that was time-consuming. And therefore, someone could do things like make shoes and provide for their family because it was a type of art. And it was time-consuming, and therefore it had a particular value attached to it because you wouldn't do it unless you could be compensated adequately in order to do it. But now you can make shoes in a factory, so you can pay somebody minimum wage or less than in a third-world country that has no rights, has no standards at all, really, and you can have children working in factories or whatnot. And there's really no such thing as a cobbler except sort of as a niche thing now. So the way that people view the value of money radically changes. And usury now comes in as some sort of magical process that makes money on money. Rather than money being made on the trades of goods, it's money being made on the agreements that people have on how they ought to trade their money and how that value will go up or down based on basically confidence in markets. Forgive me for you actual economists out there who understand this better than I do. I'm just trying to explain it in a basic way. And therefore, usury is basically making value from nothing. So it's sort of fictitious value. And this is one of the reasons why it's condemnable historically, because it's a fantasy. And because of this, it's limitless. So when you get into this system of usury, it's a very easy tool for exploiting people. because it plays on desperation. Someone is in need of money, and you say, sure, I'll give you $100 at 30% interest. Each week it's 30% on top of 30%, but you need that money. And you sort of play on people's weakness. Now, there's weakness on both sides. The person who comes and agrees to it makes a huge mistake, but the person who has it to give and does so in a usurious manner is also a huge scoundrel. And the church has always understood that, which is why it was just condemned and banned as something that was just, because of our concupiscence, because of our ability to fall into our lower passions. It's just like it's kind of like, it's the message of the Lord of the Rings. It's like you don't put the ring on because it's just not worth it, because it will lead us to bad places. Capitalism really feeds on usury in our modern day. It just does. I mean, it's credit and debt, interest on everything, and debt makes people slaves. And it causes a lot of misery. Again, we all have personal responsibility. We can budget, we can do things, but the popes here are looking at society. The Pope here is looking at society as a pastor of souls and saying, in line with the church over time, there's just something wrong with this thing, and we just can't allow it because the consequences are too dire, and we just see it time and time again. So we have to just cut our losses. So usury is just something that's been always condemned, and so he talks about why unchecked capitalism, as it's understood, which relies on usury, ought to be checked. Okay, the role of the state. The state should promote justice, protect workers' rights, and intervene when necessary to ensure the common good without overstepping. This is paragraph 36. Whenever the general interest or any particular class suffers or is threatened with harm, which can in no other way be met or prevented, the public authority must step in to deal with it. Let's read that again. Whenever the general interest or any particular class suffers or is threatened with harm, which can in no other way be met or prevented, the public authority must step in to deal with it. So this is a hard one. What's the line where you're supposed to do that? Well, the principle in general is there are certain calamities, certain trends that just will destroy a lot of people's lives, and the state ought to step in to help out. We saw that, although for ill, but we saw that mentality during COVID. Again, it was for ill, but the mentality was there was this disaster befalling society, which is going to have economic consequences. So we need to basically find a way to help people by giving them money. Now, that just caused worse inflation, and it was a disaster because of a usurious system and the money printing and so forth. But the mentality that the state has a role in helping you if you need it in certain circumstances, this isn't something that's inherently based on the welfare state. This is something that's found in the thought of principles of Christian economics. Nonetheless, key line here is where is it? Without overstepping. So there are certain things, certain tools the state has, but there are limits. So the trick is a prudential decision to find ways to understand those limits. Now here's probably the most controversial part, and this is probably the last one I'll read here, because I want to get onto some other stuff. Support for labor unions. Now, labor unions have largely become Marxist enterprises. Not all, but largely have been infiltrated by a Marxist spirit of this class warfare. Pope Leo saw this coming and was trying to get around this or get ahead of it. So he endorses this idea of having these workers' unions, and he says such associations should be suited to the requirements of this our age. It is gratifying to know that there are actually in existence not a few associations of this nature, consisting either of workmen or of workmen alone or of workmen and employers together. So that's the key. And actually, I'll just go down a little bit because it links to this last point that I have here and calls for collaboration. And he says, the great mistake made in regard to the matter now under consideration is to take up with the notion that class is naturally hostile to class, and that the wealthy and the working men are intended by nature to live in mutual conflict. Each needs the other. Capital cannot do without labor, nor labor without capital. And there's an advocacy for cooperation among all parties to achieve social harmony and justice. So, workers' unions today, largely problematic. I used to be in a union, and it was a Marxist thing. I can tell you horror stories of even some trades unions around here that I've seen it happen, where they will basically intentionally destroy someone's business because he won't unionize. He doesn't have to, but they use the courts to do it, and it's just drown him in debt, and nothing comes of it, but the union wants to get rid of that so they can bring in more members. That sort of evil stuff does happen, but the principle behind the associations of workers was something that was always part of Christian civilization. We can think about guilds, for example, and many different thinkers were trying to find a way to deal with this class warfare that was coming up. And Leo XIII thought, okay, associations are good. There's a good idea for solidarity. But at the same time, he calls for collaboration, where it's not just the union of the workers versus the union of the owners, because that's just for the class warfare, which is what we see today. So, for example, in Ontario, in our education system, we have the teachers' union, which I used to be a part of, which was totally Marxist. And then we have the union of the administrators and the principals, basically, and they're just seen as like these warring parties against each other. And then they all war against the government, which has the Department of Education. And it's like, the government negotiating with the government about who can get one over on the other person while they can all still be rich. It's like, it's stupid. The solution is to not have them all separated. The solution was to integrate them all together as part of a trade, recognize their different gifts and qualities, and have them collaborate on how to basically help each other out, because you just have to do that if you're going to have social cohesion. And this was something that in the life of Archbishop Lefebvre, his father was very loyal to the teachings of the popes, and he had organized his textile business. I think it was fabrics they made. He had organized his business so that there was an association of all employees, including the owners, so they could work collaboratively. And it was a wonderful place. Now, it was destroyed because of the First World War, essentially, because a lot of things were. But that was the ethos behind it, and that was the Catholic mentality. So there's a basic overview of what is in Rarum Novarum. Of course, there's much more. And if I made any mistakes on specific economic things, please don't scream at me in the comments. I did my best. But I was asked to talk about this, and I wanted to do so briefly. Now, I do want to move on to a couple other things, though, that I hope Pope Leo the 14th will imbibe like Pope Leo the 13th. Pope Leo the 13th wrote triumphantly against two major errors. One of them is liberalism, and one of them is modern philosophy. And I want to read you briefly here a couple quotations. So, liberalism is the philosophy of Freemasonry. And Freemasonry is, we all know what it is. It's this cultish thing, whatever. But really, the real problem with it is that it is liberalism. That's the main problem. I write in my book, What Happened to Catholicism, which you can find linked underneath. Whoops, why did this happen? That's annoying. Sorry. I write in my book, What Happened to Catholicism, which you can find underneath, where that even if there were never any lodges or anything like that, it would still be a problem to have liberalism spread by other means. I'm trying to bring up the book thing here. I don't know why it didn't go. There we go. There we go. Back and forth. Sorry, my keys were off. And in any event, so the real error of Freemasonry is liberalism. Well, Pope Leo XIII wrote an encyclical called Humanum Genus. And in fact, I did narrate that. I'm going to bring it up here. Humanum Genus. Let me do this here. And it's available to listen to. I will just pull that up for you. So you can see on the screen there. I'll make it a little bit smaller. I have Humanum Genus, and this is the encyclical of Pope Leo XIII on Freemasonry, and you can go listen to it. It's almost an hour long, and I've narrated it for you. In any event, he condemns Freemasonry. Most importantly, though, he condemns the errors of Freemasonry. And I want to read you a quote. So this is from the beginning of Humanum Genus, written by Leo XIII. And there's a reason why I think this is fascinating, and I hope our Holy Father will imbibe this, and I think he will, and I'll tell you why. This is what he writes at the beginning, Leo XIII, that is. The race of man, after its miserable fall from God, the creator and the giver of heavenly gifts, through the envy of the devil, separated into two diverse and opposite parts, of which the one steadfastly contends for truth and virtue, the other of those things which are contrary to virtue and to truth. The one is the kingdom of God on earth, namely the true church of Jesus Christ. And those who desire from their heart to be united with it so as to gain salvation must of necessity serve God and his only begotten Son with their whole mind and with all an entire will. The other is the kingdom of Satan, in whose possession and control are all whosoever follow the fatal example of their leader and of our first parents, those who refuse to obey the divine and eternal law, and who have many aims of their own in contempt of God, and many aims also against God. And here's a money line. This twofold kingdom St. Augustine keenly discerned and described after the manner of two cities, contrary in their laws, because striving for contrary objects. And with a subtle brevity he expressed the efficient cause of each in these words. This is St. Augustine speaking. Two loves formed two cities, the love of self, reaching even to contempt of God, an earthly city, and the love of God, reaching to contempt of self, a heavenly one. And why is this at the beginning of an encyclical on Freemasonry? Because Freemasonry is liberalism. Liberalism is the exaltation of man over God, the rejection of the supremacy and the primacy of God, and the exaltation of the supremacy and primacy of man. Our new pope is not only called Leo, but he is an Augustinian. And this right here is from St. Augustine's perennial, his Confessions and his City of God book are probably both his magnum opuses, whatever. But this is from City of God by St. Augustine. I guarantee you, if he really is an Augustinian, I don't think the Augustinians even today are formed without understanding the notion of the city of God versus city of man. And this is the perennial struggle that faces us, an attachment to the world versus an attachment to heaven. And when you look at the writings of Pope Leo XIII on economics, you see this same spirit. Is it about the exaltation of the material creature, or is it about the exaltation and the glory of God? And that has to play into economic decisions as well. And the Freemasonry, the Masonic forces and so forth, they are of the party of Satan. And they will exalt the city of man over the city of God. And that is what is at the heart of this new sort of industrial revolution, where it is all about facilitating greater creature comfort, more reliance on hyper-rational sources, and a loss of mystery and union with God and an understanding of metaphysical principles. We are becoming like machines, reliant on machines, who have no attachment, in the good sense, to our real nature, in which we find the image and likeness of God. And that's scary. And Pope Leo XIV seems to find that scary as well and wants to address it, and he's chosen Leo XIII, which is great. Now, I want to share with you one more thing before we end here, because part and parcel with this liberalism is bad philosophy, which I write about a lot in my book, What Happened to Catholicism. And there's another encyclical that Leo XIII wrote, which I imagine our new Holy Father knows of, if he knows Leo at all. And it has some interesting claims, and I'm going to bring that up for you. So I'm actually going to read this. This is from my new book, What Happened to Catholicism. Link for that underneath. And it's on page 40 or 50 or something like that. I can't remember the chapter, but I'll just read it from my notes here. And in his encyclical called Depuis le Jour, Leo XIII wrote, "We renew our condemnation of those teachings of philosophy which have merely the name, and which, by striking at the very foundation of human knowledge, lead logically to universal skepticism and to irreligion. We are profoundly grieved to learn that for some years past, some Catholics have felt at liberty to follow in the wake of a philosophy which, under the specious pretext of freeing human reason from all preconceived ideas and from all illusions, this is part of liberalism, denies it the right of affirming anything beyond its own operations, thus sacrificing to a radical subjectivism all the certainties which traditional metaphysics, consecrated by the authority of the strongest thinkers, laid down as the necessary and unshakable foundations for the demonstration of the existence of God, the spirituality and immortality of the soul, and the objective reality of the exterior world. It is to be deeply regretted that this doctrinal skepticism of foreign importation and Protestant origin should have been received with so much favor in a country so justly celebrated for its love of clearness of thought and of expression. Now, he's writing this to French bishops. So what he's talking about is he's talking about the imbibing of the ideas of the German philosophers Kant and Hegel and so forth, who are at the heart of the modern liberal Enlightenment understanding of knowing things. And this is part and parcel with this relativist way of life that we live today, where we have basically turned the assessment of what is true into a completely subjective affair based on our own preconceptions and assumptions about the nature of reality, which begin in us and are separated from the exterior world. This is a huge problem. This is why people are obsessed with virtual reality. This is why people are basically happy to live vicariously through a machine rather than live as a human being with real senses through which we know things truly. So Leo XIII was spot on about the errors of modernity, philosophical, political, and so forth. And I hope that our new Pope knows Pope Leo beyond just Rarum Novarum and will actually bring to light for this new era many of the ideas of Leo XIII that are more applicable now than they've ever been. Pray for the Holy Father, and I'll talk to you next time. God bless you all. Bye-bye.